Oh, come on. Hasn't been that long since I started this project. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff, and yes, the Xbox One S PC mod is finally in a place that I'm happy enough to talk about it. It's definitely not done yet, but I figured as this project has been going on for a while now, I should probably explain where it's at, what the difficulties have been, and show off some of the progress and things that I'm happy with and things that I'm not. Let's get started. This project started out innocently enough with me browsing eBay late one night and finding this Xbox One S shell with no internal components at all. And I thought to myself, I could probably fit an ITX computer into that. And so the project was born. Getting started on this project, I just needed the Xbox One S shell itself and an ITX motherboard and a graphics card off the shelf to see if I could even cram them inside of this 7.5 liter enclosure. Yeah, there's not a lot of room inside of this. And to my surprise, an ITX motherboard actually fit fairly well and even situated itself almost perfectly under the existing fan vent. The graphics card, though, was another story. You see, graphics cards have this uncanny ability to just be large, and no matter what orientation I was going to try to cram this graphics card in here, it just was not going to fit. Now, they do make small form factor and even single slot graphics cards, so there's things like this AMD Radeon WX 2100 or the legendary 1070 Katana. But as you can tell, even though these are very slender and would fit in the height of this case, number one, the WX 2100 isn't exactly setting the world on fire with its performance, and number two, the Katana is still too big. So I did what any modder at heart would do. I sought out to make my own heatsink for a graphics card so I could cram it into this case. And the winner was a Dell GTX 1650 OEM graphics card that I mated to a NVIDIA Quadro K2000 heatsink. And strangely enough, not only did it work, it ran fantastically well, getting temperatures maxing out at only about 65 degrees Celsius. So I finally had my combination of parts, an Intel i3-10100 and a GTX 1650. And from there, this kind of faded into obscurity, not because I lost interest in the project, but because I ran into some hurdles that I didn't know how to overcome. You see, even though I had basically all of the components to put the system together, I was never going to be happy with the way it was going to turn out. And that centered around a couple of different things. Number one being the power supply. I had picked up a 220 watt Pico power supply, which requires a 12 volt, 20 amp external power brick to be able to run. That is taking all the transformer circuitry out of the case itself and putting it into a brick that is nearly 1/3 the size of the Xbox One S, kind of defeating the purpose of cramming a system into a shell this small. Couple that with the fact that I went through about 3 or so dozen revisions on the rear I/O shield so I could actually mount my graphics card and have the motherboard I/O tray accessible and looking fairly stock, and it just kind of became too difficult and more difficult than it was going to be worth. But as it often tends to do, time marches on, and with time came some new parts that might breathe some new life into this project, starting with the graphics card. You know, that thing that I spent all that time modifying? Yeah, now there was an off-the-shelf component that I could just drop into here and make it work. That is, of course, the RTX A2000, one of the world's most powerful compact graphics cards. It is still a 2-slot card, but in a half-height solution. It features 3,382 CUDA cores based on Ampere technology, which means it's about equivalent to something like a GTX 1070 or 1080, all while using only 70 watts of power. Of course, there was also news on the power supply front that made me much more eager to jump back into this project, and that is the release of the Flex HD 250 watt power supply. Now, this is not sponsored by Flex HD, but buying this unit absolutely got this build back on track. You see, inside of here is the entire power supply. All that I have to plug back in here is an AC power cord directly connected to my wall, just like the Xbox One S. And I get a full 250 watts of 80 plus bronze efficiency, which is more than enough power to run the i3-10100 and the RTX A2000. Storage has also gotten insanely cheap as of late, which is, again, a good thing since I have absolutely no room inside of here for any SATA SSDs. I was originally going to run just a 512GB NVMe drive, but since NVMe drives have plummeted in price, I can now fit a 2TB NVMe drive in here for less than $100. So I'm pretty much out of excuses at this point. It's time to just put the thing together. And this is where I went from, again, super excited about this build to feeling a little bit lackluster, kind of in myself. And I wanted this to be a fully polished, production-ready system. That is something that looked exactly like an Xbox One S off the shelf, down to every last intricate detail. That's the way I like to mod things. And I just couldn't fully quite get that last bit of polish on here. But, as the old adage goes, if you never finish the project, then you're never going to be able to use the project. And so I figured it was better at this point to put it all together, turn it on, make it run, make a video about it, and just enjoy it for what it is, rather than stressing over this line isn't perfectly flush, or this panel is a little bit gapped more than I would like, or this screw hole is a little bit augered out, or I cracked the case over here and I'm really bummed about that. Instead, let's just take a look at what an awesome mod it turned out to be. So after all that work, we have a 7.5 liter PC running an Intel Core i3-10100F 4-core 8-threaded processor on an Asus ROG Strix B460i motherboard with 32GB of DDR4 3200 MTS memory, 2TB of Gen 4 NVMe storage, and an RTX A2000 with 6GB of video memory. Not too shabby, especially considering what was inside the Xbox One S to begin with, which I guess in this case was nothing. One of the things that I'm immensely proud of is the power button still works as the power button. It looks exactly the same, it has the same mechanical click, and it works as a power button for the PC. Also, the front LEDs that I reused the opening for the DVD reader in, really happy with how that turned out. Although I had originally planned on custom making either an aluminum or a 3D printed channel, it turns out hot glue is a lot easier to put that in place and make it look good from the outside. So that's what I did. While I made the base of the console essentially a production-ready part, I stripped away all of the internal gusseting, added a custom 3D printed motherboard tray complete with brass standoffs, which means I can swap out any ITX board that I want in the future, keeping the system upgradable just like it was a regular PC case. The rest of the system, though, is kind of bodged together. Originally, I wanted the backplate to be one cohesive piece, complete with industry-standard mounting points. That is, a PCI Express slot and a motherboard I/O tray, so you could swap in and out parts at your leisure. And as it turns out, there's now an RTX A4000, which is the most performant PCI Express small form factor graphics card on the market. Hey, PNY, give me a call. I'd love to put one in here. But I could never get it to print out flat, and I could never get the geometry quite right, and I had standoffs and cutaways in all kinds of various positions, so laying it flat on a print bed just never quite worked out right. What I wound up with was a two-piece design, so the motherboard has its own backplate, and then the graphics card has its own. And I custom designed the I/O cutaways for the graphics card, complete with venting, so we can screw the graphics card into that custom backplate, and it also holds the power jack on the rear. It's not necessarily upgradable without completely redesigning the part, but it does hold the A2000 in exactly the right spot. Back to the downsides of this system. It also didn't hold the RTX A2000 level inside of the case, so it was actually pulling and bowing the rear I/O shield and not supporting the graphics card completely. What I ended up doing was printing essentially a little bridge to sit on top of the bottom of the chassis and hold the RTX A2000 in exactly the right position. Now that means if I turn the case upside down, the RTX A2000 wants to flop to the roof of the case, and vice versa. If I flip it back over, it'll fall back down onto that riser. But at least it holds it in the right position when we're in this orientation, so I think we're good to go. Having that little riser in there also gave me just the right amount of cable management space to hold the USB 3.0 front header. Oh, by the way, the USB port on the front of here still works. But it allowed me to route that cable back under the graphics card and then loop back forward, plug into an extender so I could actually get some bend in the cable and then plug into the USB 3.0 header on the board. I don't know if anyone else knows this, but the US 3.0 header is basically the worst internal cable that's ever been designed. It is not flexible, you cannot plug it in from any angle other than 100% perpendicular, and in a small form factor case like this, it ended up coming up like this high if I just plugged the header straight into the board, so I had to get a flexible connector to make it work. But hey, the USB port does work. And finally, we had to get the top panel on here and make it secure so it looked like a finished product. And that was probably the biggest challenge, mainly because of that power supply. While I did get a 250 watt power supply with internal transformer inside of this chassis, it fits within about 1 millimeter of its life, and in fact, the case is bulging on both sides to make it work. To get it to fit depth-wise, I had to shove the power supply all the way against the front of that bottom half of the chassis, and then I had to custom make some upper brackets so I could screw it in and hold it tight so it wouldn't rattle around inside the case. However, that also meant that none of the front brackets would meet into the bottom chassis anymore, so all of these are just kind of floating, and in fact I ended up removing about half of them, so the case doesn't latch here in the center anymore. That means all of the physical connections are done on the side, but the Xbox One S is a click-apart unit, and I didn't want that to be that way anymore. I wanted to be able to unscrew it and remove the top as you would a standard PC. So I ended up getting some 3D printed spacers and set some threaded inserts inside of there, and then drilled some holes and some flush mount screws. And that works, I will say, fairly well. It's not perfect, but it does close. So with that, we have a fully working Xbox One S PC that turns on, has lights, and has pretty much enough horsepower to game at 1080p at high settings. How does it run? Performance-wise, it's excellent. Temperature-wise, now the CPU and GPU don't actually get that hot. There is plenty of ventilation in here for the CPU to draw in cool air from the top and vent it out wherever it makes sense through the rest of the ventilation in the case. Same thing with the GPU. It has all of this side venting to pull fresh air in from the side, and then it's a blower fan design so it blows all the hot air out the back. Both CPU and GPU get direct sources of cold air, and therefore run usually between about 50 and 60 degrees Celsius at max draw. It's that 250 watt fanless power supply that gets a little toasty. You see, there's also not enough room for fans despite my best efforts. You might have noticed when I put the top panel on, there are actually 3 different fan mounts that I tried adding to the sides to force air to flow through the chassis and over the top of that power supply. I was never able to get the fans completely working and fitting inside of this case. So the power supply has no fan and no open ventilation to the outside world. So it just kind of swelters in its own 250 watt, 80 plus efficiency heat. Now, while the system does run, and can run for hours on end, it does make me a little bit nervous for the longevity of that power supply, because heat is the ultimate killer of electronics. And having no fan and no open world ventilation, this gets quite toasty, especially when you consider it's held in place with 3D printed parts. Now, while both the motherboard tray and the uprights that are holding the power supply in place are printed with carbon fiber PETG, which is fairly heat resilient and very stiff, it's still 3D printed parts, and enough temperature and enough time can make goo out of us all. So what can the system do? Well, it can play Switch emulated games up to about 60 frames per second with fairly acceptable lows, including Super Mario Odyssey and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Not that I needed to play those on my TV as I have a Switch, but now the Xbox can do it as well. It handles pretty much every other emulated console with ease. That 10100F is fantastic when it comes to single-threaded performance, and the A2000 holds its own when it comes to 1080p rendering. So is this mod finished? Well, it does turn on, it looks good from some angles, and it's a PC that I'd be happy to take to a LAN party or plug into my TV as a dedicated gaming console. But if I never assembled it, it never would have ran. And so take this video as kind of a public service announcement if you want to get into PC modding. When you start a project as ambitious as this, it is very easy to get discouraged, get sidetracked, lose focus of the plot entirely, or even buy all new parts and think you'll just upgrade them as you go. In reality, I was designing the system around an ITX board and a GTX 1650 that I made a custom heatsink for. I kind of let new parts and new goals for the project cloud my path for getting this finished in the first place, which meant instead of being an Xbox One S PC mod, it was an Xbox One S shell with parts that I couldn't use in any other project because they were dedicated to this one. If you want to get into PC modding or crafting of any kind, I suggest finishing your projects. Even if it's not going to be the vision that you had originally, even if you think there's a better way you could do it later, you can always do a revision B, you can always do a revision C, you can always buy another Xbox shell, reprint out parts, and put something together that is better and more polished than you had the first time around. But an unfinished project is always an unfinished project, and as okay as I am with how this one turned out, I'm thrilled that it's now up and running. So, where is the Xbox One S PC mod? It's right here. It looks pretty good, it's running now, and it performs pretty well. And I am very happy that I can finally call this project done, as I can always revisit it and make it better. As always, if you're interested in any of the parts from this build, as outdated as they may be, I will have affiliate links down in the video description. Go give those a look. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. And leave me a comment down below if you have any unfinished projects that you need to get out of your closet, or if I've ever mentioned something that you want to see a follow-up on, because likely that's a project that's sitting out in my garage that I need someone to light a fire under my ass for. If you like this project and want to see more like it, there's an easy way to help support that. Head on over to craftcomputing.store and grab yourself one of our nucleated pint glasses, now available in this hops and brews motif, which, I'm not gonna lie, I like a lot. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys. Beer for today is from Level Brewing up in Portland, Oregon. It is the Game On IPA, clocking in at 6.5%. A big juicy citrus hop aroma with lots of hop flavor and moderate bitterness balanced by a smooth malt backbone. Some of the best totally not copyrightable can art I've ever seen.